October 4th, 1918. A small bird, weighing less than a pound, bleeding from shrapnel wounds, missing an eye, with one leg barely hanging on, flew through enemy fire, carrying a message that would save 194 men from certain death. That bird's name was Cher Ami. And what you're about to hear, well, it might just change how you think about the creatures we share this world with. Now, before we dive deep into this, grab yourself a cup of coffee, maybe some tea, settle back into your chair, because this story, this piece of history, it's something special, something most people have never heard the full truth about. And I want you to stay with me until the very end, because what these birds did, what they sacrificed, it deserves to be remembered. Oh, and if you find this interesting, hit that subscribe button. Stories like these, they need to be told. All right, let's begin. When we think about World War II, when we think about the heroes of that time, we picture soldiers storming beaches, pilots in their fighters, sailors on destroyers cutting through the Atlantic. We think of Churchill's speeches, of Roosevelt's fireside chats, of the resistance fighters hiding in the shadows. But there's another group of heroes, thousands of them, who never get mentioned in the history books, never get their statues, never get their moment of recognition. And yet, without them, hundreds, maybe thousands of soldiers would have died, cut off from their units, surrounded by the enemy. No way to call for help, no way to let anyone know they were still alive. I'm talking about pigeons, homing pigeons. Now, I know what you're thinking. Pigeons, those birds we see in the park, the ones we shoo away from our sandwiches? Yes, those birds. But let me tell you something. During World War II, during World War I before it, these birds, these remarkable creatures, they were as vital to the war effort as any radio, any telegraph, any piece of technology we had. More vital in many cases. Because when everything else failed, when the radios went dead, when the telephone lines were cut, when runners couldn't make it through enemy fire, the pigeons flew, and they saved lives. See, the thing about modern warfare, the thing that made the world wars so different from anything that came before, was communication, or rather, the desperate need for it. Armies spread across vast distances, battalions cut off in forests, in mountains, behind enemy lines. Officers needed to know where their men were. Soldiers needed to call for support, for supplies, for evacuation. And in those days, in the early 1940s, communication technology, it wasn't reliable. Not like today, not even close. Radio sets were heavy, bulky things, needed batteries that died, needed clear signals that got jammed or interrupted. And in the chaos of battle, with explosions all around, with buildings collapsing, with tanks rolling through, radios failed. They failed all the time. Telephone lines, they got cut. Artillery fire, tank treads, sabotage, those lines lasted hours at best. Runners, soldiers who physically carried messages from one position to another, well, they had to cross open ground, had to make it through machine gun fire, through minefields, through territory crawling with enemy soldiers. Many of them never made it. Many of them died trying to deliver a single piece of paper with a few words scrawled on it. So military strategists, they started looking for alternatives. And they remembered something that had been used for thousands of years, something ancient, something that had been carrying messages for humans since the time of the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans. Pigeons, homing pigeons. Birds with an ability that even today, even with all our science, all our understanding of biology and neuroscience, we don't fully comprehend. These birds, you release them hundreds of miles from their home, and they find their way home, every single time. Through storms, through darkness, through conditions that would leave a human lost and helpless, they find their way home. And so, as war broke out across Europe, As Hitler's armies marched through Poland, through France, through the Low Countries, both sides, the Allies and the Axis, they began breeding pigeons, thousands of them, training them, preparing them for what was to come. The British, they had pigeon lofts all across the country, the Army Pigeon Service, they called it. By 1944, by the time of D-Day, the British military had over 250,000 pigeons, 250,000 birds, each one trained, each one ready to carry messages when everything else failed. The Americans, they had their own program, started a bit later but ramped up quickly once they entered the war. And these weren't just any pigeons, mind you. These were athletes, bred for strength, for speed, for stamina. A good homing pigeon, in ideal conditions, it could fly at speeds of 60 miles an hour, could cover 500 miles in a single day, could navigate through weather that would ground aircraft, through fog, through rain, through conditions where visibility dropped to almost nothing. They carried messages, strapped to their legs, tiny capsules containing paper, with coordinates, with requests for support, with intelligence about enemy positions. Now here's where it gets interesting. Here's where the problem really shows itself. Because when you're in the middle of a battle, when you're pinned down by enemy fire, when your radio's been destroyed, and you've got wounded men bleeding out around you, you need to get a message out, fast. You need someone, anyone, to know where you are, to send help, to send medical supplies, to send reinforcement, or at the very least, to know that you existed, that you fought, that you didn't just disappear into the fog of war. And this is where the pigeons came in. Soldiers carried them in small cages, portable lofts they called them, lightweight containers that could be strapped to a backpack or carried by hand. Inside, a pigeon, calm, waiting. And when the moment came, when communication was needed, a soldier would write out a message, short, concise, often just a few sentences, coordinates, situation report, casualties, supplies needed. They'd roll that paper up tight, slide it into a small aluminum or plastic capsule, attach it to the pigeon's leg with a rubber band or a clip, and then they'd release the bird. Can you imagine that? Can you picture it? You're in a foxhole, artillery shells screaming overhead, machine gun fire ripping through the trees around you. Your radio operator's dead. Your telephone line was cut hours ago. Men are dying. And your last hope, your only hope, is a bird. A small, fragile bird that you're about to throw into the air and pray, just pray, that it makes it home. That it doesn't get shot down, that it doesn't get lost, that it delivers your message before it's too late. And more often than not, they did. They made it, through conditions you wouldn't believe. There's a pigeon called William of Orange, British bird. During the Battle of Arnhem in 1944, Operation Market Garden, one of the most disastrous Allied operations of the war, British paratroopers were dropped behind enemy lines in the Netherlands. The plan was to capture key bridges, hold them until ground forces could arrive. But the intelligence was wrong. The Germans were stronger than expected, better positioned. The paratroopers got cut off, surrounded, massacred. And in the middle of that chaos, with radios failing, with casualties mounting, they released William of Orange. That bird flew over 250 miles back to its loft in England, flew through German-occupied territory, through Dutch skies, crawling with enemy aircraft, through weather that was getting worse by the hour. And it made it, delivered its message. Because of that message, command knew the situation on the ground, knew how desperate things were. And while they couldn't save everyone, couldn't turn the tide of that particular battle, they adjusted their strategy, saved lives that way. And William of Orange, that bird received the Dickin Medal. It's like the Victoria Cross, but for animals, the highest honor an animal can receive in British military service. Then there was Paddy, Irish pigeon, believe it or not. June 1944, D-Day. the largest amphibious invasion in history. Thousands of ships, hundreds of thousands of men hitting the beaches of Normandy. And in the middle of all that chaos, the Allies needed intelligence, needed to know what was happening inland, beyond the beaches, beyond the coastal defenses. They had resistance fighters, had scouts deep in German territory. But getting information back, that was the challenge. Paddy was with a reconnaissance unit. They'd observed German positions, counted tanks, noted artillery placements, critical information. Information that needed to get back to command immediately so they could adjust the invasion plans. And Paddy flew that message back, flew from France across the English Channel in just over 4 hours, fastest time recorded for that route during the entire war. Because of Paddy's flight, Allied commanders had real-time intelligence, could direct naval bombardments more accurately, could tell the advancing troops what they were about to face, and Paddy, like William of Orange, received the Dickon Medal. But let me tell you about one more, about the bird I mentioned at the very beginning, Cher Ami. Now technically, Cher Ami's story is from World War I, not World War II, but I'm telling you about it because it's the story that made the Allied forces realize just how valuable these birds could be. It's the story that led to all those pigeon programs in World War II. And it's a story that even a century later still has the power to humble you. October 1918, the Meuse-Argonne Offensive. American forces pushing through the Argonne Forest in France, trying to break through German defensive lines. It was brutal fighting. Dense forest, difficult terrain, entrenched German positions. And in the middle of this offensive, there was a battalion, the 77th Infantry Division, about 550 men led by Major Charles Whittlesey. And through a combination of aggressive advancement and miscommunication with other Allied units, they pushed too far forward, got ahead of their support. And the Germans, they saw the opportunity. They encircled them, surrounded them completely. Now, this battalion, they became known as the Lost Battalion. Though they weren't really lost, they knew exactly where they were. The problem was, nobody else did. Command didn't know their exact position. And so, when American artillery started firing to support the offensive, they were firing short. They were hitting their own men. Shells landing right on top of the trapped battalion. Men being killed not by the Germans surrounding them, but by their own artillery. Major Whittlesey, he was desperate. He'd sent runners, but they'd been killed or captured. His radio didn't work. He had carrier pigeons with him, had released several already with messages, but those birds had been shot down by German soldiers who knew what they meant. And as the artillery fire continued, as more of his men died, he had one pigeon left, just one, a small blue-gray bird, Cher Ami, French for dear friend. Whittlesey wrote out a message, his handwriting shaky from exhaustion, from stress. The message said, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." He attached it to Cher Ami's leg, and he released the bird. Now the Germans, they saw that pigeon take flight. They knew what it meant, and they opened fire. Rifles, machine guns, everything they had. They were trying to shoot that bird out of the sky. And they hit it. Multiple times. Shrapnel tore through Cher Ami's chest. One bullet took out an eye. Another shattered a leg, left it hanging by a tendon. The bird tumbled, started to fall. And for a moment, the men watching thought it was over, thought their last chance had just been shot down. But Cher Ami somehow regained flight, with one eye, with its chest torn open, with a leg nearly severed. That bird flew 25 miles back to its loft. Took 25 minutes, when normally that flight would take half the time. But it made it. Landed in its loft, more dead than alive. The message, covered in blood, still attached to what remained of its leg. The message got through. The artillery stopped. And because of that, 194 men survived. 194 men who would have died from friendly fire made it out of that forest. Not all 550 made it. The Germans saw to that. The conditions saw to that. But those 194, they lived because a small bird refused to die until its mission was complete. Cher Ami survived, barely. Medics worked on the bird, saved its life, though they couldn't save the leg. The pigeon was fitted with a small wooden leg, became a hero, was awarded the French Croix de Guerre. And when Cher Ami finally died, months later from the wounds, the bird was stuffed, preserved, and put on display in the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., where you can still see it today. A small, unassuming bird, a hero that saved 194 lives. Now, these stories, these famous pigeons, they're the ones we know about, the ones that got medals, that got recognition, but there were thousands of others, thousands of birds that flew through enemy fire, through terrible weather, through conditions that tested every ounce of their strength. And many of them didn't make it. Many of them were shot down, killed by enemy soldiers who understood the threat they posed, or caught in storms, or attacked by hawks and falcons, or simply succumbed to exhaustion. The British kept records, detailed records, and those records show that during World War II, the Pigeon Service lost tens of thousands of birds. Some estimates put it at over 100,000. Each one of those birds was carrying a message. Each one represented soldiers who needed help, who needed rescue, who needed someone to know they were still fighting. And when those birds didn't make it, sometimes neither did the soldiers. But the ones that did make it, the ones that got through, they saved lives in ways that are hard to quantify. There's a mission, Operation Columba, that the British ran during the war. They dropped thousands of pigeons over occupied Europe, France, Belgium, the Netherlands. These birds were in small containers with parachutes, dropped at night over areas where they knew there were resistance fighters, where there were people opposed to Nazi occupation. Each container had a pigeon, food, water for a few days, and a questionnaire, instructions in the local language. The questionnaire asked about German troop movements, about fortifications, about anything that might be useful to the Allies. And the idea was simple. Whoever found the pigeon, if they were sympathetic to the Allied cause, they'd fill out the questionnaire and release the bird. The pigeon would fly back to England, carrying intelligence from behind enemy lines. Now, you'd think this wouldn't work. You'd think most of these birds would be found by German soldiers or by civilians too scared to help, or would just die in the countryside somewhere. But you'd be wrong. Over 16,000 pigeons were dropped as part of Operation Columba, and more than 1,000 of them came back with intelligence, with information about German positions, about troop strengths, about supply lines. Information that Allied intelligence analysts could use to plan bombing raids, to coordinate with resistance groups, to understand what was happening in areas they had no other way to observe. And some of the people who found these pigeons, they took enormous risks, because if the Germans caught you with a British pigeon, if they caught you filling out a questionnaire for the enemy, that was espionage, that was treason, that meant execution. Not just for you, sometimes for your family, your neighbors. The Nazis didn't play around with that sort of thing, but people did it anyway. Found these birds, fed them, cared for them, wrote out what they knew, and sent them back, risking everything to help. And those pigeons, they carried that trust, that courage, back across occupied territory, back across the Channel, back to England. There's a story, one that didn't come out until years after the war, about a resistance fighter in Belgium. He found one of these pigeons, one of the Operation Columba birds, injured, wing damaged. It couldn't fly. And he knew that if German soldiers found it, they'd trace it back to his village, his family. But he also knew that the information he had, information about a German ammunition depot hidden in a nearby forest, that information needed to get to the Allies, could save lives if they bombed that depot. So he kept the pigeon, hid it in his cellar, nursed it back to health over 2 weeks, 2 weeks of risk, of danger, every day wondering if the Germans would search his home. And when that bird's wing healed, when it could fly again, he filled out the questionnaire, added his own notes about the ammunition depot, and released it. That pigeon made it back to England. The depot was bombed 2 weeks later, a successful strike that destroyed ammunition the Germans desperately needed. And that resistance fighter, he was never caught, never knew if his message made a difference. But it did. Now, it wasn't just the Allies using pigeons. The Germans had their own pigeon services, extensive ones. They'd been using carrier pigeons since World War I, just like everyone else. And they knew how valuable these birds were, knew that a pigeon carrying the wrong message could compromise their positions, their plans. So German forces, they trained soldiers to watch for pigeons, trained marksmen to shoot them down, placed guards at key locations with orders to kill any bird that wasn't one of theirs. There are accounts of German soldiers using shotguns, using nets, even using trained hawks to take down Allied pigeons. They took it seriously, very seriously, because they understood the threat. A single bird getting through with the right message could lead to an air raid, could reveal their positions, could cost German lives. And so the skies over occupied Europe, they became a battlefield in miniature. Pigeons trying to get home, German forces trying to stop them. A war within a war. But the Germans also used pigeons for their own communication, particularly later in the war, when Allied bombing had destroyed much of their infrastructure, when telephone lines were constantly being cut, when radio communication was being jammed or intercepted. German officers used pigeons to send orders, to report positions, to coordinate movements. And just like the Allies, they had their own pigeon heroes, birds that flew through dangerous conditions, that delivered critical messages. There's an irony there, isn't there? Both sides using the same creatures, the same ancient method of communication, trying to gain an edge in the most modern, most technological war the world had ever seen. Thousands of years of human history, and we still relied on birds to carry our messages when everything else failed. Now, after the war ended, after the celebrations, after the soldiers came home, these pigeons, what happened to them? Some were retired, kept in lofts, allowed to live out their days. The ones that had received medals, they were cared for, honored. Cher Ami, as I mentioned, ended up in the Smithsonian. Other famous pigeons were preserved, put in museums, their stories reported for history. But most of them, they just disappeared into obscurity. Thousands upon thousands of birds that had served, that had risked their lives, that had saved soldiers. They were released or sold to private owners or simply forgotten. Because that's how it goes, isn't it? The war ends and everyone wants to move forward, wants to forget, wants to focus on rebuilding. And the animals that served, the horses, the dogs, the pigeons, they fade from memory. It wasn't until decades later, until researchers started going through military archives, started piecing together these stories, that we began to understand the full scope of what these birds did. How many lives they saved, how many missions they supported, how many times they were the difference between success and failure, between survival and death. The Dickin Medal, that award I mentioned earlier, it was created in 1943 by Maria Dickin, founder of a veterinary charity in Britain. She created it specifically to honor animals that served in war. And during World War II, 32 pigeons received that medal. 32 out of the 250,000 that served in British forces alone. Each one of those 32 had done something extraordinary, had flown through impossible conditions, had delivered messages that saved lives, had shown courage that puts most of us to shame. But here's the thing. Here's what gets me about these stories, what makes them stay with you. These birds, these pigeons, they didn't understand war, didn't understand nations or ideology or politics, didn't know they were heroes, didn't know that the messages they carried meant life or death for the men who released them. They just knew one thing: home. They knew home. And every fiber of their being, every instinct they had, drove them to get back to that home. Through fire, through storms, through injury, through conditions that should have killed them, they flew home. And in doing so, in following that simple, powerful instinct, they saved us. Saved soldiers who would have died otherwise, carried messages that changed the course of battles, of campaigns, maybe of the war itself. These small, unassuming birds that we barely notice today, that we take completely for granted, they were heroes, real heroes. Not because they chose to be, not because they understood what they were doing, but because they couldn't do anything else, because home called to them and they answered. There's a memorial in London, in Hyde Park. It was put up in 2004, dedicated to all the animals that served in wars. And on that memorial, there's a section for the pigeons. It says, they had no choice. And that's true. They didn't. But they served anyway. And they deserve to be remembered for it. You know, we live in a world now where communication is instant, where you can talk to someone on the other side of the planet in real time, where information travels at the speed of light through fiber optic cables, through satellites, through infrastructure so complex and so reliable that we never think about it failing. And maybe that's good. Maybe that's progress. But it also means we've forgotten something important. We've forgotten how precious communication is, how desperate the need to send a message, to make contact, to let someone know you're alive. That need, it's fundamental. It's human. And during those wars, during World War II, World War I, all the conflicts where these birds served, they were the answer to that need. They were the lifeline, the connection, the hope. And they came through. Again and again, they came through. I think about those soldiers sometimes, the ones trapped behind enemy lines or cut off in some forest or pinned down in a destroyed building with wounded men around them and no way to call for help. I think about what it must have felt like to write out that message, to attach it to a pigeon's leg, to release that bird into the air and watch it fly away, knowing it was your only chance, your last hope. And I think about the relief, the overwhelming relief when help actually came, when artillery support arrived, or medical evacuation, or reinforcements, because that bird made it. Against all odds, through everything thrown at it, that bird made it home. These stories, they're not fiction. They're not exaggerated. They're documented fact. Military records, eyewitness accounts, after-action reports, they all confirm what these birds did. And yet, most people don't know about them. Most people have never heard of Cher Ami, or William of Orange, or Paddy, or the thousands of other pigeons that served. These stories have been buried in archives, forgotten in the rush to move past the war, to focus on human heroes and human achievements. But I think they deserve to be told. I think we owe these birds that much, because they were part of that war effort. They were part of what won the war, what saved lives, what made victory possible. And their service, their sacrifice, it matters. It should be remembered, should be honored, not because they were extraordinary, though they were, but because they remind us of something important. They remind us that courage can come from the most unexpected places, that heroism isn't always human, that sometimes salvation comes on wings. And maybe, just maybe, when you see a pigeon now in a park or on a street corner, maybe you'll remember this. Maybe you'll remember that these birds, dismissed and overlooked as they are, they have a history, a legacy, that their ancestors saved lives, carried hope, flew through hell itself because home was calling them. And that deserves respect. That deserves recognition. That deserves to be remembered. The war ended in 1945. Victory in Europe, victory in Japan. The soldiers came home, the world began to heal, and the pigeons, well, most of them faded away. Their service ended, their purpose fulfilled. But their story, their incredible story, it remains. Waiting in archives, in old military records, in the memories of the few veterans who still remember releasing those birds and praying they'd make it through. This is that story. This is their story. The story of how small birds, with brains the size of a pea, with no understanding of war or sacrifice or duty, saved hundreds, maybe thousands of human lives, not through choice, not through training, but through the simple, powerful instinct to return home. And in doing so, they became heroes. Heroes that deserved to be remembered. Heroes that earned their place in history. So now you know. You know about Cher Ami's flight through machine gun fire, about William of Orange crossing 250 miles of enemy territory, about Paddy's record-breaking flight on D-Day. You know about Operation Columba, about the resistance fighters who risked everything to send messages back on these birds. You know about the tens of thousands of pigeons that served and the thousands that died in service. You know their story now. And I truly hope, you'll remember it. You'll share it. Because these birds, these remarkable, courageous birds, they've earned that much from us. If you found this story as moving as I did, if it changed how you see these creatures, there's another story I've covered that I think you'd appreciate. You can find that by clicking up above, and I'll see you there.